Okay, Mel, our listeners who listen to our podcast might actually want a podcast that has helpful tips for how to move through grief. And we have just the thing for them.
A Widowed Mom podcast hosted by Krista St. Germain.
We've had Krista on our podcast, and Krista is a certified life coach and a mom, and she teaches manageable and small steps and techniques to help uncover what's holding you back and show you how to create a future you can actually look forward to. You might not believe it yet, but you can move through your grief and live a life you love.
Krista's podcast is found on every podcast platform, so check it out, The Widowed Mom Podcast.
Well, Mel, I'm excited is always a weird word to say when you're interviewing people on our podcast because it means that like things are not good for them.
When we talked to this person initially about this, I believe it was on a Patreon hangout, I was so, again, I don't want to say the word excited, but excited to hear that she had a story like this to tell. Not because I want this to ever happen to people, but because so many people find themselves in a similar situation and nobody talks about it.
Yeah.
So let's introduce our friend.
Yes.
And then we'll talk about what this thing is. So hello, friend. How are you? And what's your name?
Hi, my name is Deborah Westwood. And I'm Deborah Westwood and I'm a widow like you guys.
Deborah, you kind of have a radio voice. Has anybody ever told you that?
No. Mm-mm.
Don't you think, Mel?
Oh, yeah. You know who you're like? You're like Roz on Frasier.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's pretty cool. Okay,
Yeah.
I like her.
Deborah might be taking over for us now, Mel. She's got
Oh,
the voice
God.
for
You
it.
know what?
No.
We all need a vacation sometime. So,
Okay, I'll fill in when you're on vacation.
Perfect. Where do you live?
I live in Eastern Washington. I've been here about 27 years. So I'm originally from California, a little bit of time in South Carolina, and now I've been here and I don't anticipate leaving here. It's great here.
I feel like East Washington is its own animal. Like there's the East and the West, and they are not the same place.
Absolutely. Well, Oregon's like that and Washington's like that. Western, Portland and Seattle are very left and liberal, and then Eastern Washington and Eastern Oregon are kind of the same way. So it's like two different states.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. Like what do you do for work? What do you do for fun?
Let's see about myself. I'm 5'4" and I'm blonde and I'm semi-fabulous. No, wait. Um, my life's not especially exciting. I've done a lot of things, but I don't have a lot of expertise necessarily in anything. But I left home as a teenager. I joined the workforce. I started some college, and then I met my husband Dan, and we had two amazing children who are just the center of my life. And so I was a full-time mom while I was married to him. Did some college there. Then I decided I wanted to be in law enforcement, so I went to the police academy in Sacramento.
What?
Yeah,
We did not know this.
yeah,
Okay.
I had law enforcement in the family, with FBI in the family and sheriff's deputies in the family, and so it's just kind of something I was always interested in. So I did the 10-month police academy. I was class president, so I got to give a speech in front of 600 cops and their families, but it put a lot of toll on my marriage at the time. So eventually I concluded it probably wasn't going to work with two little kids and a shaky marriage. So I continued school, and then the marriage did come apart. We stayed friends, but the marriage came apart. And then not too long after that, my biological father, died unexpectedly. And then my grandmother died not too long after that. And so I was kind of the last man standing. And so I ended up with kind of the family estate here in Eastern Washington. So that launched me into the kind of like, adulthood phase two. So, I moved here, I got a house, I was a full-time single mom of my kids, finished college finally with a degree in religious studies. And even though I'm not actually necessarily religious, but, spiritual, not religious, kind of check that box, right? Um, and really what I'm into mostly was my kids for a long time. I'm hugely into genealogy. I'm into birding. I'm into running, but I'm a runner with terrible joints. Music, theater, reading, animals, you name it. I'm into all kinds of stuff like that.
Deborah, you contain multitudes. Like halfway through that list, I was feeling like I had whiplash. Like the religious studies, that came out of fully
Out of
left
nowhere,
field.
right?
Yeah, like police academy, religious studies,
Birding.
and
And a lot
genealogy,
of military
birding.
in the family.
Yeah. Yeah, you are probably fun to be around. You can like ask her any trivia question and she's like, "Oh yes, I know." Because
Sometimes. And my family, we're the type that we deal with really painful things through humor. So not everybody always gets us, but I like that about some of the interactions with the Widow We Do Now community, because I found a lot of fellow sort of macabre humor as a way of getting through this stuff. So yeah,
You are our people for sure.
absolutely. I met Larry in March of 2004 through our mutual friend Match.com. And right, he was a great deal going because he was suffered from a lack of self-confidence, and I was blonde intellect. So we met and we vibed right away. It was just a pretty instant connection. We had so many shared interests and just so much in common. We
which
both
we've established are wide and
yeah,
deep.
They're vast.
kinda. And he was like that too, and even more so because he had been in the military for 26 years and was wired like me, but he had traveled around the world. And so, but yeah, we were. My kids said we were the same person in two different bodies, and it's true. We had all these shared interests. We had both moved out of kind of painful childhoods in our teenage years. We both just love to talk, obviously, and talk and talk and talk. Um, yeah, it was very similar people. We were stubborn and inquisitive and intense and opinionated and super silly, but also super serious. And so, yeah, we were met. I knew right away he was my person, and we were meant to be with each other.
I'm wondering what his family situation was like. You had two kids from your previous marriage. Did he bring kids into the picture?
He
And
did not,
oh,
and that
okay.
was part of the reason I wasn't necessarily thinking I would find somebody, because I just kind of didn't want to deal with mixed blended situations. He had been married
Amen.
before. Yeah, yeah, right. I mean, dating with your kids and their kids and shared custody and all that. I just thought, I'm just going to not date until I get older and my kids are moved on. But then I met him, and I just kind of lingered on Match.com and occasionally saw people that were interesting, and then he popped up. So, and I sent him a wink, and here we are. But he had been married before. He didn't have any kids, and so that marriage eventually ended. And so he was in the Air Force. He had been 24 years in the Air Force when we met. And so we kind of did the Air Force thing for the next couple of years before he retired. So he, went through some deployments with him, and my kids got a kick out of sending him care packages. So he's in the Air Force, so we could send him packages through military planes instead of through the mail. So we would put together these absurd, huge care packages that were just crazy. And it was really cool because he came from not a great background, and he always said that it was the first time in his life he had felt like really, really special, because he would just get the biggest care packages of all these guys, and he would share all this crazy stuff that I sent. So it was pretty cool, and it was a pretty magical time for us. And then he took us to Europe in 2005, and we had never been out of the country before. He took us to London and Paris, and in the Eiffel Tower, he proposed to me with my kids there. So that was pretty cool. I don't know if he would have described it that way. He had all this magical idea planned, and it didn't work out like that at all. But I thought it was pretty awesome. It involved a giant tower of seafood that was in between us and a pole next to our table. And he always thought it was awful, but it was the Eiffel Tower.
At the top of the Eiffel Tower.
Yeah, in a restaurant in the Eiffel Tower. Yeah,
Wow.
The
A tower
seafood
in the
tower.
tower.
Yeah.
I know, right? I'm not complaining, because so we got married in 2006, and our wedding vibe was kind of a shameless Prince Charming vibe, because it was like a really cool wedding for me, unlike my first one was not as great. So it was just this, the invitations were Prince Charming, and it was a magical day. It really was.
So what year was this that you guys got married?
That was July of 2006. We spent the next 15 years of our marriage co-parenting with my ex and his wife, who came here, and we all got along really well. We're that weird family who, they played golf together, and we all got along, so that worked out really well. We lived a really active family life. The kids went back and forth between our two houses, a week on, week off. So, we would travel with the kids, and then we would travel on our own, and we just did a lot of stuff. We had a lot of fun. We did the things you do with kids. And after they finished college, our plan was to do just a ton of traveling. We were both really, waiting for that time to do that. And so throughout all those years we were together, we were joined at the hip. We were that couple that's probably really irritating, not in a public display of affection kind of way, but we were just like super, super close. We were, we were just super attached to each other. You know, if we would go to do something on our own, if it was more than an hour, we'd call and be schmoozing with each other. And I think a lot of people would have found our style of relationship suffocating, but it just really worked for us. We were just, we were just that close. He was my best friend. He was my partner in crime. We were wired the same way, and we were home. He had a bad childhood. I had not a great childhood. And I think for both of us, we were home. No matter what was happening, no matter how much we could get on each other's last nerve, we were home to each other. I still wear my wedding ring. I still consider him my husband. I got a great big, tattoo on my arm that represents him. And so, this next phase of my life, I don't know what it's going to be, but I don't really see myself being with anybody but him. He was my person.
So, Deborah, what happened to him? We're just going to go straight for it.
So he had for years an asymptomatic leaky mitral valve, and lots of people have that. It's pretty common, and a lot of people go through life and it's never a problem. But for him in 2021, he started to have symptoms. But we were lucky, quote unquote, because one of the best cardiothoracic surgeons around in the region was a top expert right here in our city. We were told that he taught other surgeons and that people came from great distances just to be operated on by this guy. He was the guy for robotic mitral valve repair. He told Larry that he had done the procedure 1,700 times, although when he was under oath, that number was quite a bit different later on. But still, it was a lot. It was hundreds of times he had done this procedure. So Larry did all the necessary pre-surgical stuff, full CT scan, blood work, all that. He had no abnormalities, no pre-existing conditions. So we went for it. December 6th, 2021, we checked in for surgery, and he was supposed to have been home in 3 to 4 days post-op and back on, a golf course or active in 2 weeks. So this was a routine, minimally invasive procedure. And we felt safe with this guy. So he had the surgery. It went smoothly. The valve was actually repairable, so it didn't have to be replaced. He stayed one night in the CICU, and that's a normal thing for this procedure. And then they moved him to the regular cardiac floor the next day. He had some post-op pain, but that was considered normal. But by day 3, his stomach swelled up hugely. And he looked like he was pregnant. And I even took a picture because we were joking that, oh, you're pregnant with Larry Jr. And that was funny. And we were laughing. He was really miserable, but we were laughing. And then, it became not funny. Over the next, I guess, 10 days, he just steadily deteriorated. And what we didn't know we were dealing with was that during the cardiac catheterization part of the procedure, where they thread the wire through the aorta into the heart using an X-ray guided fluoroscopy video kind of thing. I don't quite understand it, but it basically makes a video and it's an X-ray. And that allows the surgeon to watch his progress with the wire and see if anything goes wrong. And so what happened during that was the surgeon accidentally nicked Larry's superior mesenteric artery, a body part I'd never heard of, and caused a tiny little dissection or a little tear in the artery. And so it wasn't like a dissection you hear where the person, bleeds out in an hour. This was a little tiny tear. And this was not malpractice. This is a known risk of cardiac catheterization. And so, but what should have happened, he should have seen it and he should have stopped the surgery, because technically this was an elective surgery. It wasn't emergency surgery. But for whatever reason, some reason, he didn't see it. And so we just continued on, none of us aware that this was happening. So this little tiny tear bled very slowly over these ensuing days, and it caused these enormous blood clots to form in his arteries that cut off the blood supply to his bowels. And so what that meant was, throughout all these days in the hospital, his bowels were dying. And as it turns out, that's an extraordinarily painful process to happen. And in addition to that, that caused all these other things to happen that were also terrible. But Larry was a beast. We used to talk about what a beast Larry was. And, an incredibly strong man, an incredibly physically fit man. He was athletic his whole life, incredible strength of will. And he somehow managed to survive when our experts said he absolutely should not have survived as long as he did, but he did. And it was just a train wreck. And like we talked about, the details of what happened, I could fill up 4 hours of podcast. So like, how can I condense down what happened to him in the hospital, the things that led me to the lawsuit? I'm going to try to do that in as abbreviated of a fashion as I can. So the theme of the train wreck was this word called ileus that I had never heard before. They decided early on that the cause of Larry's big stomach was a post-operative ileus. And that is basically where, when you've had your system shut down through bypass, sometimes it takes a while for your bowels to sort of get back online and start moving again. So that's a postoperative ileus. It's more common in an abdominal surgery, which is not what Larry had, but it can happen with this kind of surgery. And that's what they decided it was. So the way that you clear an ileus is through time. It just gets going on its own, and walking around, movement, and that'll make things work. So throughout literally the entirety of his hospitalization, every single person we interacted with confidently told us, Larry has an ileus. He just needs to walk. It'll clear it up, and he'll be good to go. So we looked it up. Looks like ileus clears in 2 to 3 days. Great. But it never did. It just proceeded to get worse and worse. So, while his entire team was pledging allegiance 100% to ileus, he was dying, and nobody ever figured it out when they should have. He went through severe nonstop pain that nothing would control his pain. Dilaudid, morphine, you name it, nothing would control it. The only time he got any relief was if they would siphon off liquid from his belly, and that would give him a little bit of relief. He went through 7 nasogastric tubes. That's where they put the tube in your nose and it goes down into your stomach. Well, they would keep clogging and failing, and so he got to go through that 7 times. They put him into acute renal failure through a series of almost comedically bad healthcare decisions. And that culminated in one night where the nurse got annoyed by the beeping of his machine, so she just turned it off. So that meant he went for double-digit hours with no pain meds, horribly dehydrated. His kidneys were shutting down, and he was in agony. And the nurse that showed up the next morning, hit the alarm and told me that she was horrified when she found him that morning. He was gray. She said, he was just in horrific condition. The head nurse came in and told me, oh yeah, his situation was near catastrophic, nearly septic, incident reports would be filed. They were so sorry. And none of that went into his medical record. During this time, he went 5 nights with absolutely no sleep because they couldn't get the NG tube to be compatible with a sleep mask because he had apnea. He was strict MPO the whole time. So he was basically starving during all this without sleep and with a lot of pain. He lost 25 pounds. He became oxygen dependent. So he got so bad that he couldn't exert himself, sitting, standing, walking, whatever, without really complete exhaustion. So day 6 post-op, a general surgeon was brought in. And this guy's important because he made arguably the most fatal decision of lots of fatal decisions, but what he did was especially bad. This guy was an arrogant, sarcastic, egotistical piece of shit, to put it mildly. He was an awful human. So what he did, he wrote down and this was 5 days before Larry died. He wrote down in his differential diagnosis, cannot exclude ischemic bowel due to thrombotic event. And then he ordered a CT scan without contrast, so that would never have found the thrombotic event. Without contrast, you're not going to see the veins. You're not going to see it. And so in ordering this, he said it was because of the damage that had been done to Larry's kidneys. But Larry was already improving with that, and his kidney numbers were well within the bounds of the hospital's written protocols for CT with contrast. And it's a heck of a lot easier to treat a kidney with a day of dialysis, whereas if you miss this thrombotic event causing ischemic bowel, the patient's going to die 100% of the time. But he stood by his clinical decision to do the CT without contrast later on. And when I asked about the results of that test the next day, because I knew he needed that test, they told me, yep, your husband's got an ileus. So even though that is not what that test showed, we don't know who looked at that test, but that's not what it showed. So we continued on thinking, that he had an ileus despite, him getting worse and worse. And so as the days went by, what was happening was the medical personnel that he was dealing with would come in, they would berate him and shame him and basically treat him like he just needed to suck it up. Mr. Westwood, you just need to walk 6 times a day. And, like he was just some kind of a wimp, even though he couldn't. And they said, and you've always got to have 2 people to walk with you because of how bad off you are. And then the rest of the time they ignored him. I couldn't get people to come in and help us walk. So, if he needs to walk to clear his ileus, then I need someone to help me because he's 6'1", he's 190 pounds, he's muscular, he's big, he's oxygen deprived, so he's super unsteady. He's got an IV pole with all these wires connected to him. He's got an oxygen tank with wheels. He's got a walker that he needs to use. And, walking by himself or even with me wasn't going to happen. So we were kind of damned either way at that point. And so that just wasn't happening. And it just got worse and worse. So in the last few days of his life, he just started telling me, I'm going to die in this room. And I said, no, you're not. We're going to get you better and we're going to get you home. But he just continued to get worse. And in the last 3 days of his life, he had just excruciating, round the clock, every 30 minutes on average, liquid bowel movements. And it was horrible. And I later learned that what this was the lining of his bowels coming out. So what that meant in plain terms is my husband was pooping out his bowels for the last 3 days of his life. Because of the situation, the short staffing, the nurses were amazing. They were of all of this, they were amazing, but they were so incredibly short staffed. And so this was happening spontaneously and he had really no control of it. So he ultimately decided it was better to let me help clean him, than waiting for nurses who just couldn't make it on time to the room every 30 minutes. So that was just a horrible existence he had that just absolutely killed his dignity, and was horrible to deal with. I mean, just unspeakable pain. And what we didn't know was that they did an imaging, a diagnostic on the 15th that showed his bowels were in critical need of emergency care. It showed worsening and then more worsening conditions. And it actually, what was written down was that he had a high grade small bowel obstruction. And that was on the 15th from that diagnostic. On the 16th, they didn't do any diagnostics at all. They took the NG tube out, introduced clear liquids to him and said he could go home in a day or two, which if you saw him was insane. There was no way this man could have gone home. But, that's what they said. And I won't elaborate on what he was like, but when I left that night, he was completely broken. And if you knew this guy, he was just a beast of a guy. He was a master sergeant. He was just a manly man, and he was just broken. But, they gave him soup and lemon ice and said he was going to go home, and technically his bowels were moving. And so I thought, well, they must know something I don't know. So I left, and a few hours later he crashed at 4 a.m. and I of course wasn't there because I couldn't be there. But later I read what that was like, and it was horrible. And it just kills me to this day that I couldn't be there with him for that. He was all by himself when this was happening. I don't know if he knew he was dying. I don't know what he knew. He couldn't breathe. It was awful. So they rushed him to CICU, where a resident actually performed a lactate test. And that is a simple blood test that measures lactic acid in the blood, and it tells you if you've got dying tissue, basically, if you've got, ischemia. And so a lactate test under 2 is normal, and a lactate test over 4 is severe, and his lactate was 11.9 when they ran it. And so, I mean, the fact that nobody on his team thought to run this test is just unconscionable. And, if they had run this test any time in the previous 5 days, Larry would be alive. This is a blood test. I mean, they already had an IV in him, just pull out some blood. And none of them thought to do this, even though they could all tell you what the test was. They were all so focused on ileus that they didn't, and even though they had it in front of them, everything they needed, they didn't do any of it. So, our experts said that number meant his bowels had been dying for days, and that, this large window of days where they could have saved him, they could have done several different things, pretty simple things, all of them, and that would have saved him. But, ileus. So they finally did a CT scan that morning with contrast, but by then it was too late. When they opened him up, his small bowel was not pink. It was gray and black and disintegrating and smelly. And the contents of his bowels were leaking into his abdominal cavity. And he was septic. And he had pneumonia in both of his lungs. And the icing on the cake was that he had an NG tube coiled up and jammed in his throat. And so his heart stopped a couple of times during the Hail Mary surgery, and they did extensive CPR a couple of times. So he undoubtedly had broken ribs on top of everything else. So obviously they realized that this was futile. They stabilized him. They slapped a bandage thing over his open abdomen, and they came and brought me into the little devil room of, where they give you the bad news. So I'll remember for the rest of my life the CT surgeon telling me while Larry was still alive on life support, this isn't survivable. This is not, what that means in that moment is so huge. And then a few minutes later, he said to me, we may never know what happened. And to this day, I mean, my face was melting. It was on fire. The walls were moving and melting, and my body was just exploding and imploding at the same time. It was just this incredible you know, reaction on every level. And even then, I knew, though, there was no way that we were not going to get to the bottom of this. My husband walked in there, 59 years old, healthy, multiple trips, photography trips overseas to different countries. We had all kinds of stuff planned, and he was going to be leaving in a box. So there was no effing way that I wasn't going to find out what happened to him. And that was just appalling. And it was pretty evident when we left that hospital, they were done with Larry. Larry Westwood was, that was it. So they hustled us into the CICU, and he was on life support. And I said, tell me everything so that I can make a decision. And they said if he somehow survived, which was unlikely, his existence without bowels would be horrible, and that he would never eat or drink again. And, everything in me was like, yeah, I don't care. Save him, keep him with me. I don't care. But my mind said, absolutely not. Larry would never have wanted to live that way, being the kind of person he was. And he would have hated me if I had kept him alive, even to endure any of that, only to die anyway. And so I made the decision to let him go. I decided I was going to turn off the life support, and I said, I want to do that right now, because he could wake up, and if he wakes up in this liminal sort of state and he's in pain and he somehow figures out what's happening inside of his body, there's no way that I wanted that to be his last memories. So they turned on the machines, and I held his hand, my son held my other hand, and you can't describe what that's like, because the day before he was still fine. They were talking about him coming home, and it's like every moment was this crazy battlefield in my mind and in my body of like panic and horror and shock and outrage and pain and terror and total disbelief. How is this happening? Am I looking at my husband and watching him die? And did I do that? Wait, can I still save him? Is it too late? Can I change my mind right now? And all this is happening. And then this voice in the top of my head was just screaming, no, you have to do this. You have to do this. It was insanity. And fortunately, it only lasted about, I don't know, maybe 15 minutes. And the numbers just went down to zero until I recognized, they're too far down now. And then he was gone. So.
Hey guys, just checking in and want to say, if you are enjoying this podcast
and you want to see it keep going, maybe it's helped you through your widowhood journey and you think that it might help others on their widowhood journey, you can support that cause by joining our Patreon.
Some of the things that you get as a Patreon beneficiary are ad-free episodes, so you don't have to hear ads like this.
You also get exclusive content, and at a certain level, you might also get an exclusive t-shirt. You can only get that place.
That is true. It's pretty cool. There are 4 different tiers available, so check it out. It's patreon.com/WWDN.
And as an extra bonus, very often you get your names read by one of my kids, and they will do a terrible job with the pronunciation. And that's like a bonus, I think.
I think it's kind of the best. I would much rather hear somebody butcher my name than say it correctly.
A child butcher it than an adult do it correctly. Yep. So go to patreon.com/WWDN to keep our podcast going and support the widowed cause.
Yes. Thanks, guys. Back to our regularly scheduled program.
Okay, wow. And you just did such a good job of summarizing that. I think that we can recognize that that's probably because you have had to do that a lot in the aftermath,
yes.
Yeah. And I totally appreciate, it's not the right word, but recognize this idea that once we get something in our heads, it's really hard to see the evidence that it's not what we think it is. Like, humans are really good at telling ourselves that like confirming to ourselves instead of thinking critically. And that's why, sometimes things like policies and are helpful to override that, or just getting other people, in to make those kind of decisions.
A consult.
Yeah. So it sounds like in this time frame, you didn't understand what had happened, like right afterwards.
No idea.
But it sounds like you were like immediately like, we're going to figure this out. Did you go straight to the idea of taking a legal route, or was it like, how am I going to figure out what went wrong?
Um, Not entirely, but and one thing real quick, they call that diagnostic momentum. That's what my attorney explained to me. When they get it in their head, diagnostic momentum, even though all this evidence was there and it was plainly available and all these people were looking at it, they all had ileus on the brain and that's all it was. Um, no, I got home and kind of, in shock and whatnot, but I had promised him I would find out what had happened to him. And so I decided, okay, what do I do? Before I freak out, I can do that later. What do I need to do right now? First thing, I need to get an autopsy. Before they burn his body or his body disappears or whatever, I need to get an autopsy. And I didn't know what to do after that. But then I remembered that I'm a bulldog owner, and bulldog people are weird, and we all know each other through the dog shows and the breeding and the rescues and whatnot. And so I knew a lady in Philadelphia who was a medical malpractice attorney, and she had been for some 30 years. And so she was a bulldog rescue person. And so I called her and told her what had happened. And she just became this absolute warrior for us for the next 4 years.
A bulldog, if you will.
A bulldog. Yeah, she was a bulldog. I mean, she did. She grabbed onto, once the information started coming to her, she did. And she was like a bulldog for 4 years. She would not let go. But yeah, I was not looking at a lawsuit initially. And she says this is what most people come to her for. They come for answers because they can't get them. And I went for answers. That's what I wanted her to help me do, was get answers, cut through the BS and the red tape and the answers. And so, I started with her counsel. I was trying to get these records. And so I went through, a couple of rounds of, I filled out the form. I asked to request the records, and they sent me 309 pages and said, that's your husband's medical record. And she said, yeah, no, that's not even close to his full medical record. So, but they insisted it was, and they sent me a 309 page printout, said, see, that's your whole record. And so I had to get her involved at that point because it became pretty apparent pretty quick I wasn't going to get anywhere on my own. And so when they got involved, they produced 1,390 pages of records. And that was not even his full medical record. That was just the hospital record. So there were tons more medical records. Yeah, it became obvious pretty early on. They were trying to, they were going to try to run me out of the game before I could get any further momentum. The CT surgeon called me about 2.5 months after Larry died, obviously a damage control phone call. And I think he was voluntold, hey, you better call this lady. She's starting to ask for more and more medical records. So he gave me the apology and the contrition, and then he lied to me. And he told me that he visited Larry every day. Well, by that time, we knew he hadn't. I only ever saw him once. And we had audit trails that showed he had not checked in. He had not seen Larry. So he lied. So at that point, I really kind of knew what I was up against. So they got fully on board. They sent the notice. We started getting in information, and she did. She clamped down like a bulldog on all of this stuff. And it didn't take long before this absolutely horrible picture started to emerge of what had happened to him. And that it just at the outset, it was awful. And I pretty quickly realized, yeah, that I need to do something more about this than just get the answers. What's happening here is bad. And it just got worse. They didn't tell us anything. And so even though I was advocating for Larry in the hospital, no amount of advocating would have worked because I had, 8% of the picture of what was happening. And what I got was incorrect. And so, and I was advocating my ass off, but it didn't matter.
So now you've decided that you need to take the legal route. But here's the question that I have, because when you're looking at that, and people listening to this will have gone through the same decision-making process, and maybe they decided a different way, or maybe they did go down this route. But like, what if you don't win and you have to pay your attorneys? Like, or just like the whole monetary part of this, because attorneys are not cheap. So did that play into any of your decision where you were like, I don't know, because if we're going to go into this, I know like we have to be able to win. Otherwise, like the hospital has a gajillion dollars and you don't. So how do you like make that decision?
For me, that decision wasn't especially difficult because every state's a little bit different, but most states, they take cases on a contingency fee basis. So what that means is that if you win, they get a certain percentage and you get the rest. But you're right, you are on the hook for all of the fees associated with your case. And as it turns out, that's a lot. I never actually asked that up front. I just kind of figured, oh, this will all work out, didn't think to ask that and how much it was going to be. And I think because my attorney knew that, this would be a winning case, that, we would probably be fine. I just didn't think about that because what I was motivated by was the fact that what I saw was that this wasn't a mistake. People sue for just a one-time thing. This was an absolutely systemic failure of people who were apathetic. I was dealing with people who were arrogant. There was a lot of incompetence. I saw definitely evidence of some internal politics. So there were a lot of reasons that I decided to pursue this. I was angry. I wanted justice and accountability for Larry, and I wasn't going to get him back, but because I was so determined, I was going to do this and see if I could make some kind of change in the system. So I was more focused on that than I was, what is this going to cost me at the end of the day? I probably should have been, but that's kind of where I was. So yeah, I moved forward with the idea that I wanted protocol changes more than anything else because, I couldn't get my husband back. I literally in 4 years never talked about money. I did not, the topic of money did not come up until the very, very end, the very last month when you had to talk about it. They had to, because you had to put a number on the table. And so other than that, I never talked about it in any context. I never asked. I mean, I could see that the fees were adding up because I was getting copies of all this stuff. It was a lot.
Yeah, I know in the state of Utah, because I know some people who have had to do this, you approach the medical malpractice attorney and they go and collect, that you have to be the person that can sign consent for them to go get the medical records.
Right.
And then they go through everything. Their team goes through the records and then they determine if it's something that they think that they could possibly win at. So say there's something that might be, say the person that died had an underlying cause, even if it's not related to it, they have to weigh the risk of, would that hold us up in court? And would that possibly make it so that we didn't win this case?
And I've actually got kind of some material that this is, because this is such an important part of this, kind of prepared for just that. The hurdles you have to jump over personally in your private stuff. And like you said, anything, and that's what the attorney's going to be doing at the outset, is looking at all that before they decide to take your case.
But even like medical records, they charge like some ridiculous price
Right?
for medical records. They're like, it's $30 a page. And you're like, oh, okay. Like,
You know how much my fees, and I was going to get to this later, my costs and fees were $270,000.
and that was all in medical records.
That
probably.
was all
Not really, but
expert witnesses, depositions, videography, transcripts, you name it, $270,000. And that was without going to trial.
And
Imagine how much that goes up at trial.
And
Yeah.
can we even talk about how you're a widow, you're going through the most stressful life event ever. Not only did your person die, but your person died with what you assumed to be malpractice at the time. The stress, can you talk to us about what that was like for you, your body, your mind, just that time period? Because that's a whole lot.
It is. Yeah, it is. And a good therapist. I have been with my therapist now from the very beginning, and that has helped. And one of the things I talk about, in my paper that I wrote, is that this is an incredibly lonely journey for a number of reasons. And your therapist and your attorney are going to know all of this stuff that nobody else knows for a variety of reasons, from people not being able to handle it to you're not supposed to talk about it, whatever. And so really my therapist knows more about all of this than anybody in my life, mostly combined. And so without a therapist or without some resource, you will lose your mind. And I nearly lost my mind more than once.
so during this, were you not supposed to talk to people about it?
My attorney wasn't actually all that particular about me talking.
Oh, okay.
So honestly, I talked to everybody.
Okay.
I did. There was
Good.
another case that I interacted with this person, and they had been told not to talk to anybody, anywhere, anytime.
That would
And
be
most
so
of the time, they
much.
tell you not to do social media. I was just enough on my own. I didn't want to put anything out on social media. I was really careful during the 4 years to make sure I didn't put anything political out there. I didn't put anything anywhere that anybody could dig up to use against me. I mean, they do slimy stuff. They take photos of you out in public doing stuff if you look like you're happy. And so God forbid they find something that they could sneak in front of a jury. So I was just, for 4 years, I mean, you give your life up for this, really. And so for 4 years, I watched everything I did in every kind of way.
Did
It's
anybody
crazy.
take pictures of you and do that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I had a
So
guy come up behind me in the library and he was videotaping me. And I don't know if it was related to the case or not, but I'm sitting at the library doing genealogy. I'm looking at, 17th century records from Philadelphia. And this guy's standing behind me videotaping me. And I turned around and looked at him and, he put the phone down, but then he picked it back up. And I don't know if it was related, but I've never had that happen before. So, is that paranoid? I don't know. It was super weird.
You mentioned when they nicked that, that artery, that wasn't malpractice. Like there are some things that are known risks of procedures and probably a lot more than
Yeah.
we would be comfortable with. Like when they say they do
Right.
informed consent, it's like, oh, it's like the medication commercials where they're like
Yeah,
may
exactly.
cause blah 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 blah
Yeah.
blah
And you just
death.
go sign here.
Yeah, and you're like, okay, fine. But like it is interesting because that's not what we're talking about. There's lots of those. And I think sometimes like it is tragic and it is unfortunate, but like those things do happen and it's
Absolutely.
awful. But this is like a different animal because it was like we took that known risk and then we compounded it by a lot of other terrible
Yeah,
decisions.
and if it was just one or two things, that's understandable. Mistakes are understandable. Errors, somebody's tired and they make a mistake. And I asked myself all those questions before I decided to file a lawsuit. But this was, like I said, it was systemic failure. It was, without going into all these details, this was arrogance. This was two different people that I dealt with who were directly responsible for Larry's care, including the doctor I talked about, who was profoundly arrogant when he interacted with me. And he had a bunch of medical students with him who he was posturing for these guys, and it was really obvious he was posturing for these guys. So I asked him, why is Larry still in such bad shape? He was supposed to be home 3 days ago. And he looks at me and he says, you mean besides the fact that he just had major surgery? And no, this wasn't that kind of a major surgery. This was a minimally invasive robotic surgery. And this was 6 days into it with this huge belly and all this pain and all these things happening. And you would think that even in that moment, he might have said, hey, maybe I should take a little bit harder look or something. But he was so arrogant. And believe me when I say that's who he was. And he's still practicing.
what?
Yeah. Two of our three defendants are not still practicing, but he is.
Oh, really?
What does it take to get a doctor like that to not be able to practice anymore?
You can't touch their licenses. What it truly takes, it comes back to money. What it comes back to is their insurability. So if they get enough dings on their record, then they can't get insured. And if they can't get insured, they can't practice. And so the worst you can do to a person like that who continues to work is hope that either their employer decides they're not worth continuing to, take hits for, or eventually they get enough hits on their, for their insurance. Every year they have to get their insurance re-upped, and they have to give the name of any medical malpractice cases. And so I take solace at least that once a year he will have to say my husband's name. So, that's as close as I could get to running him out of medicine, and I hope he runs himself out.
You said it took 4 years to have
Hmm.
this all finished.
Yep, 4 years to the date.
That's a long time. And it sounds like it's exhausting and a lot of work. Like tell us the bad parts about it.
How much
I-
time you got?
yeah, I'm like, I don't know if there are any good parts about it, but like help us get a sense, like for people who are thinking, man, I wish I would have gone that route, or should I go that route? Like give us a little taste of like what you're signing up for when you do a medical malpractice lawsuit.
Yeah, at the outset, what I would say is, uh, the outset, the civil justice system is perverse. It's broken, and it really heavily favors the defense. So know that going into it. Um, and Yeah, it's a hot mess. And I think that the costs, the emotional costs, the physical costs, the mental costs, the financial costs, all of it are huge. For a lot of people, they would be prohibitive. For me, I ended up in the emergency room once because of, the way things culminated. They scheduled the deposition of Larry's CT surgeon on the 3-year anniversary of Larry's death. So I'm in there on that 3-year anniversary listening to this guy talk, and all these other things are happening, and I needed to have my hip replaced and all this different stuff. And yeah, I just I didn't have a breakdown or anything, but I started having these really incredible freaky symptoms that were like an epileptic seizure type symptom, and it was stress induced, as it turned out. So, what can it do to you? It can certainly do that kind of thing to you. I could see a person drinking. I could see a person, using drugs, certainly having a nervous breakdown. It's a horrible, horrible process. And Some of the reasons for that are because from day one, you are actively living with your person's death over and over and over again. You're reliving these details, dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of times. So it's like living in a state where it's kind of almost ongoing. Your person's death is kind of ongoing because it truly isn't resolved till you're done with it, till you either get a settlement or you go to a courtroom. And you're not only reliving it, but you're reliving it with these nasty defense attorneys who are doing everything in their power to break you and to drive you out of the system, to drive you out of the game. And words can't express how slimy and how low they will go. So their job is to break you. Their job is to try to see if they can find a way to break your case. But in a case like ours, where they knew they couldn't break our case, so they were really insistent on breaking me. So yeah, when the things you have to go through, and I think this is the stuff that's pretty important to know. So you're thinking about doing this, okay? First, like you said, your attorney is going to look at the case and determine if you have a case at all. They're going to look at the facts of your case. And then if they think, yeah, we can move forward, then they're going to look at you and they're going to decide if you're emotionally ready for this or not. They're going to look at your text. They're going to look at your notes and photographs. They're going to ask you to recount everything that you can remember, conversations, everything, and put together a timeline for them quickly before this stuff goes out of your mind. And so you've got to immerse yourself in it from the get-go before you may even be ready to do that. But that's phase one. Phase two, your case has to be absolutely airtight. There can't be holes. So that means the facts have to be on your side. So, if any diagnostics were inconclusive, you got a problem. If the case is just super complicated and maybe it can't be boiled down for a jury, that's a problem. If your person was in a bad state of mind and say they refuse a diagnostic test, that can be a problem. There's just all these different reasons that your attorney might say, medical practice absolutely occurred, but we're going to have a problem in court. So if you get through that, then that is when the attorney's also going to be looking at you during that time, your character, whether they think you can handle it. How are you going to present to a jury? It is what it is. If they don't think you're going to present well to a jury, they're probably not going to, spend their time on you.
Deb, I'm really curious. I think a lot of people listening to this, some might be in the situation where they're trying to decide if this is an avenue that they should take. So what advice do you give to people? What do you tell people if they're considering entering into a lawsuit over their person's death?
I would say that's a really complicated answer. If somebody asks if they should sue or if they should have sued, maybe the time has passed for that in their state. My short answer for most people would be probably not, with a caveat. My case was successful because the stars aligned virtually every conceivable way. But the details of how and why my case was resolved like it was are not most people's reality, not the reality of most people's situations for kind of a lot of the reasons we talked about. The facts of our case were so egregious and the evidence was so strong and so overwhelming that we believed we had a strong chance of being successful. And if we were successful, that would likely lead to significant changes that would save lives. And that was really one of my primary goals. But it was a gamble. It was a long and painful gamble. And even though I wouldn't change having done this, I'll also never get back what those 4 years cost me.
Do you feel like it was worth it for the things, like tell us some of the things that were on the not worth it side of the scale and the worth it side of the scale for you?
Well, what was worth it for me was I had 3 driving factors going into this. Number one factor that wasn't on the 3 is I wanted my husband back, but that wasn't going to happen. So what I could get was an acceptable measure of justice and accountability for Larry for what he went through and for killing him, basically. The second thing I wanted was the ability to share my story with, on podcasts and on social media and in writing, to have my story stifled. And so the way this resolved is I have a very limited NDA, and I fought hard for that NDA to be able to tell my story on podcasts. And according to my attorney, that's pretty unheard of. So that was important to me. And third, and of equal importance, is that it's our understanding and belief that what we did will lead to meaningful changes, and those will absolutely save lives, 100%. I'm certain they've already saved lives, and I know they will continue to save lives. That's what I gained in terms of the lawsuit. I gained something personally that was equally enormous. I was able to look every single defendant and every witness in the eye during their depositions. Every one of them had to acknowledge my presence. My attorney made sure of that as they were answering under oath for their role in my husband's death. So whether these were nurses or, we only had 3 defendants, but we had, a number of other witnesses who also were part of his care. And being able to look every one of them in the eye and have them be accountable was healing, and it was incredibly empowering, and it was equally incredibly painful.
If you had lost your case, would that have still been something that was worth it to be able to just have that like one-on-one, like, look at me?
I think so. Yeah, if we had somehow lost the case for whatever reason, I think that they all had to look me in the eye. They all had to face what they did. They all had to acknowledge their roles. They had to acknowledge things that they missed, the mistakes that they made. And I don't think anybody could walk, with any conscience could walk away with all that information, having been held to account, whether they were defendants or not, and make the same mistakes. I would like to believe, most of them anyway. And I can honestly rest at this point knowing that I did everything in my power to make changes, to get accountability for him. And I promised him, while he was still on life support, I promised him that I would find out what happened. I would get to the bottom of it. And I kept that promise, and his death is not in vain, and his death won't be forgotten. It won't be brushed under the rug. On a number of levels, every one of these people will always remember Larry Westwood's name, and they'll probably always remember mine too, or at least they'll remember my face.
We don't hear a lot of these stories, and so I think that is really amazing that you were able to win that in your, I guess, limited NDA. How does that work?
My situation post lawsuit, and the reason I wanted to go on podcast and tell this story, basically 2 reasons. After 4 years of going through this, I've listened to hundreds of podcasts, widow podcasts and grief podcasts. I've probably read thousands of social media posts, and I have never encountered another story of a widow pursuing a wrongful death lawsuit. I know they're out there, and most of them probably can't talk about it because they're under blanket NDAs. According to my attorney, it's very unusual that I can talk. So I want to share this story with those widows who've been through this and who can't talk about it, so they know they're not alone. So they know that somebody else has been through this. And I don't know, I think there's so much power in knowing you're not alone. You're not out there in this singular situation. The other big reason I'm here doing this is because I've heard so many widows say that they feel guilty, or they're struggling with whether they should or shouldn't pursue it, or they should have pursued it. They suspect or they believe something went wrong, but they just don't know. I'm here to say, please be okay with letting that go. You almost certainly made the right decision in not pursuing it legally. And that's not the same as saying that the people who caused your person's death should not be held accountable. Absolutely, if people caused your person's death through malpractice or apathy or any number of reasons. I mean, accidents are one thing. I'm talking about, serious malpractice. They should be held accountable. Unfortunately, our civil legal system it's perverse, and it's designed to break you. When you get into this, you'll meet your opponent, defense attorneys, who I personally think are the most despicable creatures. And to defense attorneys, your person's death is absolutely a game, and they treat it like a game. And they treated it like a game when they knew I was watching in every one of these depositions. So you have to be able to get through that. The process itself is heavily weighted toward medical practitioners. So there is a bias in doctors and nurses' favor that you have to overcome with the preponderance of your evidence and people who are jurists who are willing to get past that. The emotional, mental, physical toll this takes is horrible. And the sad part about this system is that even if you have the strongest case, airtight, you can still lose. Juries are notoriously fickle, and they can come back against you, with a defense verdict for any number of very strange reasons. So saying all that, if you're in a situation where you've decided not to pursue this, please let go of the guilt. It was probably the right decision. And unless you believe you meet all of the criteria that I've talked about, and you feel fully informed about the odds of success, you might consider channeling that energy to something different, channeling it toward another path that honors your person, or maybe looking at another way that you can pursue change. that doesn't involve attorneys and asshole defense attorneys. But if you think this is a path you want to pursue, I'm here for you, because I think there are cases where like mine, where it's worth seeing it through. If you're a bulldog like I am, and you feel like, God's on your side or evidence is on your side, and you know everything, you have a full picture, and that's what I didn't have, and that's what I want everybody to have. Here's a full picture of what it looks like, and maybe you're like, yeah, I can do that. I've written down this story in addition to doing this podcast in a document that I have on my website that you can download as a PDF, and it tells the full story of what happened to Larry and the full story of the lawsuit. And so, if you're thinking about doing this, download it, read it, hold it in your pocket, and you can carry it with you as kind of a companion when you're, weathering the storms, and to remind you that you can find justice and that there is support out there. At least with me, I'm here.
It just seems like because of those NDAs, and you don't hear stories about this, that the assumption is that nobody has succeeded. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, you just feel like, oh, but there's probably a lot of people out there who have succeeded, but they just can't talk about it. And so it's almost like you just erase that they even happened. So, which is kind of another like stacked against you kind of a thing, because you're like, well, obviously nobody's ever succeeded, so why should I try?
100%. Nobody knows anybody who's done this, and all we have is stories about how, terrible attorneys are. And, there's a million reasons to not want to pursue this. And yes, 95% of these cases settle for any number of reasons. People give up, there's problems with their case, there's any number of reasons. And of the ones that do go to trial, only about half of them are successful. And there's a number of reasons for that. Some of the ones that go to trial probably shouldn't have, because the evidence wasn't good, but the person wanted to pursue it anyway. It's a small number of cases that actually make it through the courtroom door all the way to a verdict. And then if you do get a verdict, if you get a verdict that's too big, then they're likely to almost certainly going to appeal that and drag you through another year or two of litigation. And so it's a daunting prospect on so many levels. And it's everybody's kind of their personal situation, what kind of support they have, what kind of personality you have. Like I said, I'm a bulldog. I get something in my teeth and I don't let it go. And not everybody's wired that way. And I'm not necessarily saying that's a good thing. But in this case, it was. And my husband was a bulldog. And I think I knew before we disconnected the life support that, not that I was going to have a lawsuit, that was not my intent at the outset, but that I was damn well not going to stop until I knew exactly what had happened to him. And the further I got into the process, the more I realized how horrible what happened was and how unjust it was, and that I needed to pursue it legally to make change. In addition to putting together a document that tells this whole story about what happened to Larry and the lawsuit, I also accumulated a lot of knowledge that I felt like I needed to share, both for my healing and also because I haven't seen anything quite like what I put together. So I have this document, I call it Widowhood 101. It's a PDF document on my website. You can download it for free. There's nothing for sale on that site. I pulled together all the things I wish somebody had told me right after Larry died. Almost no widows reached out to me. I was just floating in a sea of despair, and, just everything was new. I found your podcast really early on, and other podcasts and books and whatnot. And so I accumulated all of this knowledge, and I decided if I have to have all this horrible knowledge, if I have to have this insight, then I want as many people as possible to benefit from it. So I put it all together into a document that's like Widowhood 101, basic primer for early widowhood. So there's no religious, content, not that there's anything wrong with religion or spirituality. I just wanted something that would be accessible to as large of an audience as possible of new widows, kind of a no nonsense, here's the stuff you're going to feel, here's kind of what you can expect. Here's a bunch of resources. Just kind of everything I wish somebody could have sat down and told me. And so I kind of poured my heart and soul into that document too. And I want to share that widely along with sharing Larry's story. And so they're both there. You can download them. Like I said, I'm not selling anything on the website. It's both good and bad. I understand everybody has to make a living, but sometimes widow content also comes with a heavy dose of I'm selling this. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think widow coaching is amazing. I think anything where a person is helping and also making money is great. But some people don't have the resources for that. And, some people just want something that they can look at and They don't have to interact with anybody. They don't have to exchange emails in order to get this and get on a list or whatever. Here it is. Go to my website, download it. And then there's a bunch of resources in there you can use.
Where can people find this information? So you've got your Widow 101 and then you've got the whole story with the lawsuit. Like, where do people access this?
It's a website that I made after my husband died. He was a serious amateur photographer. And so when he died, I inherited 46,000 images that he hadn't processed. He loved taking photos. He didn't love sitting down and editing. And so I've gone through all but 12,000 of those photos. And I decided to put them on a website, no copyrights, no, charging for them, put them out there. If people want to use them, they can. It's all free. And it's a bunch of albums of my husband's life work of photography. And so it's a lot of years, a lot of subjects. It's landscaping, it's wildlife, it's a lot of different things. And so it's all on there. And then what I want the website to be is like a travelogue. And I picked up a camera because he was the photographer and I wasn't, because we didn't both need to be taking pictures of the same stuff. And so I was the lens bitch. I would hold lenses and hold camera bodies and point out things he should take pictures of. Take a picture of that zebra over there or whatever. And so after he died, he had trips that were booked, and I took one of them to Rwanda, and I took his one of his camera lenses, and I picked up a new camera body, and I decided, I'm going to kind of pick up where he left off. And so this website has that. It has all of his photography. It has goofy adventures that I'm starting on. I'm going to do more now that this lawsuit's over. And then I figured this was the most logical place to put these widow documents.
Okay. What is the name of the website?
westwoodwanderlust.com.
Okay. I will put that in the show notes.
This is like the Cheesecake Factory menu for widowhood. You can
Yes.
get photographs. You can get fish tacos. You can get a document about lawsuits. Like, we've got it all.
You can get pictures of seals. You can get astrophotography. You can
Yes.
get wrongful death lawsuits, and pictures of my son's wedding.
Perfect.
All in one.
All of the things.
Deb, what's your favorite cheese?
My favorite cheese is Cambozola.
What is
What
that?
is that?
It is like a half brie and half like blue cheese. So it's soft and it's still got the blue veins running through it, and it's super yummy.
Okay.
Perfect.
We'll have to check out this cheese on the Cheesecake Menu Factory.
Yeah, can you take a picture of it and put it on your site?
I totally will. Yes.
Great.
I can go straight to my refrigerator and do that because I have some in there now.
Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your story. And thank you for fighting so hard to be able to tell your story so that other people can hear it. And hopefully, like you said, just feel empowered to know kind of what you're getting yourself into and whether or not it's worth it for you. And I loved also just saying, like, if it's not for you, let go of feeling guilty, because it's not an easy process and it's not for everybody. So thank you for being here with us.
Lord knows widows have enough to feel guilty about. We find ways to feel guilty about things. And this is one that, unless you are uniquely situated in any number of ways, let it go and don't feel guilty.
Yeah. So thank you. We hope all of you have enjoyed our episode today. Make sure you check out the website and get some good information and some good photos and maybe a photo of cheese. If you'd like to keep our podcast going, check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/WWDN.
If you'd like to buy us tacos, go to buymeacoffee.com/widow we do now.
We always love a nice rating and review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And until we get to talk to you again, I'm Anita.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Deborah.
And we are just two young widows and one bulldog of a widow. And we're all just trying to figure out widow.
We
Do.
Now.
Mel, can you please tell me how you feel about therapy?
I am so grateful for therapy. I do therapy every single week.
Do you think it's a great tool in the widow's toolbox?
I sure do. I think it's a great tool in anybody's toolbox. And I am so glad that I have stuck with it, because as time goes on, there are more things that I am able to learn about myself. That goes for anything from healing from the death of my husband, to childhood things, to trying to get outside and be social, or trying to address my own certain personality. So yeah, it's really been helpful for me.
We have so many people in the Widow Wives Club who have started using BetterHelp and have amazing reviews. It takes away so many of the barriers to getting great therapy.
I know one of the things that's hard for people, and we get this question a lot, it's I need a therapist that does XYZ. Who is a therapist that is going to be widow friendly? And I know that is so hard to find. When I did therapy that was not on this online platform, it was hard. And it's kind of trial and error, kind of like a new medication, honestly, like a new antidepressant. And the way that BetterHelp is set up is it's easy to find somebody that has your specific needs as part of their expertise. And you know what? If you get into a couple sessions with that person and it's not a good fit, it's so easy to change. You can ask some of our friends in the Widow Wives Club. They've changed therapists and gotten one that has been a better fit for them. Well, a lot of them are lucky with who they get first time. I am so grateful for mine. I love her so much, and it's literally changed my life for the better.
This is amazing. So if you guys are wanting to add therapy to your toolbox or need a change in who you're seeing right now, consider checking out BetterHelp. They're one of our sponsors. If you go to trybetterhelp.com/WWDN,
you get 10% off your first month of therapy if you sign up with BetterHelp. And let me tell you, the day that I was in the hospital with my dad when he was dying, I was able to instant message with my therapist, and she checked on me all throughout the week. And I was not available for video sessions for a lot of those times because there were things we were dealing with, like mortuary stuff, and I was still able to be in contact with her. So they're very, very responsive, caring. It's such a great platform, and I recommend it to anybody who is looking for therapy.
Once again, it's trybetterhelp.com/WWDN.
And that's for 10% off your first month of online therapy.
You don't even have to wear pants, Mel.
I know this.
First-hand experience.
You can even wear a onesie.
Or a twosie.
Ooh, scary. All right, bye!